I want to thank everyone for joining us today. My name is Patrick. I'm the manager here at the DuPont Nature Center. And today is the very first talk of our 2026 Winter Lecture Series. I'm excited to announce our guest speaker today, one of our fellow DNREC Division of Fish and Wildlife co-workers, Rachel Teseener, a non-game mammal biological aide with the division. Today, Rachel will be discussing her work with the bat species that can be found across Delaware. While bats may conjure up visions of Halloween movies and other potentially negative perceptions, they are an incredibly important part of our ecosystem, not only helping to benefit the natural world, but life for us humans too. Many of us live around bats and may not ever even know it. In fact, one of the reasons we know Rachel's work so well is because we get bats right here at the DuPont Nature Center. And Rachel and her team actually have a monitoring station attached to our building to collect data on what types of bats we're seeing here. But at this point, I'm going to let the expert take it over from here and hope you all can join me in welcoming Rachel as she discusses some of the amazing details surrounding bats, a highly misunderstood native mammal. Rachel, thank you so much for being here, and please take it away.
All right, thank you, Patrick. So hello everyone, my name is Rachel. So just a brief overview of what I'm planning on talking about today. We're going to start out with some bat basics, getting to know the 9 different species that we have here in Delaware, getting to know some general characteristics that define them. And we're going to briefly touch on the different threats that bats face in Delaware and around the states. And then I'll talk about the Delaware Bat Program, what we do, what we're doing to research and conserve our bat populations here. And finally, I'll wrap up with how you guys can get involved, how you can help. And as Patrick said, at the end, we'll answer any burning questions you guys might have for me. So to start out, we're just going to go over some bat basics. Bats famously fly. They are actually the only mammal that can fly, even though there might be some mammals out there, such as flying squirrels, that might have flight in their name. Bats are the only ones that actually can fly. They also use echolocation to forage. They use ultrasonic sounds, which we can't even hear, and it bounces off of objects, and that echo returns back to the bats, and they're able to tell where they are, what's around them, and what prey might be in front of them. And speaking of what they eat, all the bats that we have here in Delaware are insectivorous, meaning they only eat insects. I'm talking moths, beetles, agricultural pests, and my favorite thing for them to snack on is mosquitoes. Bats can actually eat a whole lot of insects in one night. A singular reproductive female can eat up to their body weight in insects. And while bats don't really weigh that much, that is a lot of food for a bat. So, for example, one bat can eat anywhere from 600 to over 4,000 insects in one night. So that's a lot of mosquitoes, and I really appreciate them for their service with that. Bats also live a long time for their size. So when you think about the size of a bat, especially the bats that we have here in Delaware, they're about the size of maybe a mouse or a small rat at best. And when you think of those animals, they only live for maybe about 3 years, maybe 5. They don't live very long. Bats, however, depending on the species, can live anywhere from 5 years to up to 30 years. As a good example, the big brown bat, which is one of our most common bats here in Delaware, big browns can live up to 20 years. They're also extremely loyal to their roost sites. So these are the areas where they're roosting, where their maternity colonies are. As an example, bats have been known to be captured and relocated miles away from where they were roosting and have been able to find their way back to their colony within a few days. So they know where they are, they know where they want to be, and they're very loyal to their roost sites. So one way that is really good with distinguishing bats, getting to know them a little bit better, is understanding how they can be categorized. Bats can be broadly categorized into 2 different groups. So that's going to be the cave bat and the tree bat. And these groups kind of help us understand why they do what they do and how to predict what they might do. So cave bats, in general, they hibernate. They enjoy hibernating in caves, or in the case of Delaware, cave-like structures. They often form colonies in the spring and the summer to roost and raise their young. These colonies can be anywhere from a smaller size of maybe 10 bats to into the hundreds, 500, 600, and sometimes even more. Um, and tree bats, on the other hand, migrate in the winter instead of hibernating. They will travel long distances. This is similar to birds. We know birds migrate, bats migrate too. And these long distances that they travel can make these bats kind of hard to study because we don't always know exactly where they're going to, and it's hard to track their movements over time. So we know a little bit less about their movement patterns. Tree bats are also more solitary and roost under pieces of bark alone or in very small groups, and they also forage in the upper canopy of the forest. So to get to know our Delaware bat species a little bit better, like I said, we have 9 species of bats that are found in Delaware, and we have 5 species that can be identified as cave bats and 4 that we consider to be tree bats. So our most common species are, as I said, the big brown, which is considered a cave bat, and our second most common species is the eastern red bat. The big brown is not only the most common bat that we have here in Delaware, but it's also the most common that we have in the United States. They are a generalist. You can find them just about anywhere, regardless of habitat. You can find them anywhere from the highest populated cities to the most out in the middle of nowhere rural areas. Contrary to their name, they're not actually that big, although they are one of the bigger bats that we have here in the state. They weigh about 33 grams maximum. This is kind of the size or the kind of the weight of a handful of almonds, so not very big. And then, as I said, the eastern red bat is our second most common. They're this really beautiful light brown and red color, and this coloring is really cool because it allows them to camouflage themselves as dead leaves. The other cave bats that we have here in the state are actually considered rare. We don't really have very many of these, largely due to a disease or a fungus known as white nose syndrome, which I will talk about a little bit more. But these bats are still very cool and very fun to study. So the little brown bat looks very similar to the big brown bat. The naming structure is super creative, I know. But their size is actually about a third of the size of a big brown, so they get about 12 grams maximum. There's also the tricolored bat. This one is proposed for federal listing as endangered, but has not been officially considered endangered. They form smaller colonies than our other cave bats do. So instead of the up to hundreds and hundreds of bats in a colony, the tricolors actually have more of a small colony of maybe 35 maximum. And this next little guy here is the northern long-eared. He is actually federally listed as endangered as of 2022. Their way of capturing prey is actually pretty cool. They, like many other bats, capture their prey from the air, but also off of surfaces, and have even been known to scoop off spiders from their webs. So I know a lot of you will probably appreciate the work that the northern long-eared does for us. And the eastern small-footed is the 5th type of cave bat that we have here in Delaware, although their status is mostly unknown in the state. They have been captured here, so we know that there are at least some individuals, either residents or passing through, but other than that, we don't really know a lot about the presence of eastern small-footeds here in Delaware. In terms of tree bats, so like I said, these are going to be the ones that are migrating. We have 3 others besides the eastern red. The hoary bat is the largest bat in Delaware. They can weigh up to a whopping 35 grams, which is a slightly larger handful of almonds. Their wingspan is about 16 inches. And we also have the silver-haired bat, which, like its name, has this really beautiful silver tip to its otherwise dark brown fur. They're actually one of the slowest flying bats that we have. They only go to about 10 miles per hour maximum. And then finally, there's the evening bat. The evening bat, even though I said that tree bats don't really form colonies, the evening bat actually does sometimes and will form maternity colonies similar in size to some of the cave bats. They also migrate a long distance. There's been records of banded individuals found over 300 miles south of where their original banding site was. So that kind of illustrates why these tree bats are so hard for us to study, because all that movement is almost impossible to get constant tracking for. So to understand bats a little bit better, I think it's helpful to kind of know what a year in the life of a bat might look like. So we're going to start in the summer because that's when they're having their babies. So bat babies are called pups, and in the summer, that's when the pups are being born. Maternity colonies will be forming and active. As you can see from this picture here on the left, this is a small little maternity colony right here. This can be a small grouping, like I said, of just a few up to in the hundreds. And they form these colonies for a variety of reasons, mostly because there's safety in numbers. It's really good protection from predators, but also because there's warmth for their young. Because as you can see, these pups are pretty young and vulnerable and very, very small. So this picture on the right is a picture of a bat pup. This is a very, very new to the world bat pup. Bats can have about one pup per year, but of course, as with anything, there are exceptions. For example, the eastern red bat can have twins or up to 5 pups in a litter. Their gestation period is for about 50 days. Pups are born sightless, flightless, and without fur. And mother bats will still forage at night. They don't just stay there and starve while they feed their young. They continue to forage at night, and they can actually fly with the pups either hanging on them, but sometimes they will also leave the pups at the roost while they're hunting before coming back to nurse them. As you can see in this picture, pups are more than capable of hanging on with their teeny tiny but very strong little toes and waiting for mom to come back. And it's going to take about 3 to 6 weeks until the pups are able to fly and forage for themselves. And at that point, we're kind of entering into the autumn. So when pups are grown or grown enough to fly, the colonies are going to start disbanding, and bats are going to start exhibiting this type of behavior called swarming. And it's pretty much what it sounds like. It's a bunch of bats flying around, circling, and just doing a lot of activity in one spot. And the swarming serves a few different purposes. So it serves the purpose of assessing potential partners. They also mate during this time, and they're also surveying for potential hibernation spots if there's some of the bats that are going to hibernate. But the main focus is on mating and building those fat reserves for the winter. Now, I know I just said previously that bat gestation period is 50 days, and now I'm telling you that they breed in the autumn, and I know that doesn't make a lot of sense. So I will tell you that bats exhibit this really cool thing called delayed fertilization. And what that means is the bat can actually control when her pregnancy begins. So they do breed in the fall, and then they'll hibernate in the winter. They will delay that fertilization, and they won't trigger it until the spring. And that's when the gestation period for them actually begins. And then we enter into the winter. So the migrating bats will have migrated, but then our little resident bats, like this big brown bat you see in this picture here, are going to be hibernating. So they do enter a true hibernation. They enter a state of torpor, meaning they drop their metabolism, they drop their heart rate, and they decrease their body temperature as well. Every once in a while, they might occasionally wake up during extended, unseasonably warm periods, like those days in February where it suddenly feels like spring. But that is not super common, and for the most part, they're just going to be hiding in these tiny little nooks and crannies and crevices, hibernating for the winter. And then we enter the spring. Our hibernating bats are waking up, our migrating bats are coming back, and this is when they're triggering fertilization. And they're also beginning to colonize. They're starting to form these maternity colonies again. They're starting to find where they want to roost for the summer. And then we cycle right back to summer, and the whole thing begins again. So I do want to touch on a few things that are threats to our bat population. One large threat for bats is unfortunately wind energy. Bats collide with turbines. This is mostly affecting tree bats and migrators. And unfortunately, they seem to actively be attracted to the turbine. It's not exactly fully by accident. They are kind of seeking out the turbine, which isn't very helpful for us or for them. But efforts are being made and research is actively being done to curtail this. One such thing that people are doing is acoustic deterrence. So you might see like this little black box right here. These acoustic deterrents basically put out a bunch of high frequency ultrasonic sounds that kind of, in a way, jam the bat's signal. And it's really uncomfortable for them, and it's just all around not a very pleasant place to be. So that's one of the things that people are doing to deter bats from colliding with wind turbines. But as I said, there's constantly research being done. Unfortunately, another threat to bats is direct persecution by humans. I'm sure everyone's aware of many of the misconceptions and myths that around bats, and it leads people to be scared of them or to actively dislike them and directly try and hurt them. Disturbance during hibernation is something else that is rather disruptive, obviously, for bats. They're storing up all of this energy, and then they're entering hibernation, and they don't really have much energy to spare. So when they're disturbed during hibernation, it can cause a lot of issues for the bats. And just like any animal on this earth, pollution, habitat loss, and climate change are also threats to them. But perhaps the largest impact on bat populations in the United States is due to something called white nose syndrome. And this is actually a fungus that infects the bat. This picture here on the right is a tricolored bat that has white nose syndrome. So you can see the white fuzziness around its muzzle and its nose and on its wings. So white nose syndrome is a fungus named, and I'll say this name once and then I'm just going to abbreviate it for the rest of this talk. The fungus is Pseudogymnoascus destructans. We call it PD for short for obvious reasons. It likely originated either in Europe or Asia. It's been documented in both continents, so we don't know who we got it from. We just know that we have it. So sometime in the early 2000s, PD arrived in North America, and it attacked the vulnerable bat species, which are primarily our cave bats and our hibernators. And it resulted in unusual and very large die-offs in bats. And this was first observed in New York in 2006. As I said, it's called white nose syndrome because of that visible white fungal growth. And unfortunately, this fungus likes the cold, and like any other fungus, it also likes damp spaces. So if you think about a cave and where bats might like to hibernate, that perfectly describes where bats are going to be hibernating over the winter. And as I said, their hibernation, with their metabolic rate and their body temperature being lowered, hibernating bats are trying to conserve this energy, and white nose syndrome actually makes them more sensitive to the temperatures as they might gently warm up during the winter a little bit, and it results in them waking up and using up precious fat reserves, and that causes them to unfortunately starve to death before spring arrives. So when white nose syndrome first hit, we saw large populations of the once common little brown bat just completely dying off, and their populations went down by about 90%. White nose syndrome was confirmed in Delaware in 2012 at a couple of our known hibernacula sites, which are actually up at Fort Delaware and Fort DuPont. And it's continued to spread rapidly over the last 19 years. As of today, bats with white nose syndrome have been confirmed in most states and 9 Canadian provinces. And while we are still experiencing the impacts of this, some recent good news is we do constant sampling of our hibernacula and take swabs of the substrate and of the bats that are hibernating, and we send that out for testing. And back in 2024, when we last did our survey, all of the swabs came back negative for PD. So that was very exciting to see that our main hibernating site for our bats here in Delaware was negative, and we will continue to monitor that every year. So bouncing off of that, I want to go into kind of what we do at the Delaware Bat Program and what we're doing to research and conserve bat species. So the focus of our program is on bat research, monitoring, and conservation through efforts to monitor impacts of white nose and other threats, determining species of bats that are present here in Delaware and what their distribution is across the state, and what I'm doing here today, engaging with the public to promote bat conservation and teach people more about bats. So we do this through a variety of ways. We have multiple types of surveys that we conduct. We have colony surveys, rare species surveys, acoustic and hibernacula surveys, and we also do our best to mitigate human-bat conflict. So I want to give you guys an idea of what each of these surveys kind of look like. So colony surveys are where we go out to known colonies. So these are areas like bat boxes and barns where we know bats are continuing to go every single year to have their babies. And we do what's called emergence counts. And we could not do this without our amazing volunteers that we call bat spotters. This is a high effort thing, and our bat spotters make it possible for us to get all of this really cool data. So these surveys give us estimates of reproductive rates, they track population trends, and we assess colony health by doing looking at bats physically. So like I said, emergence counts are pretty simple. Volunteers go to these roost sites in the evening. They count the bats as they're exiting at sunset. And they do this once before the pups are able to fly, which is called the pre-volant period. And then once after the pups are able to fly, which is shockingly called the post-volant period. So most of these colonies are being counted 1 to 2 times during a survey period, but sometimes more. They can count as many times as they want. And last year, our volunteers did an amazing job conducting 81 surveys at 16 different big brown bat colonies. Some of these were bat boxes, some of these were other man-made structures such as barns or occupied or unoccupied buildings. And you can see this figure here on the left. It shows the average reproduction rate for count sites where we have 4 or more years of data, and it's broken down by site type. And you can see the data is kind of going a little bit everywhere, but the linear line kind of shows the trend. And there is a slight downward trend over the last few years, but we feel reproductive rates for big brown bats in Delaware are still relatively stable over time, despite this variation from year to year. And we also do something that is called colony catches. So this figure on the right is a picture of one of our known sites. There's a bat box up there with something called a harp trap leaned up against it. And what the harp trap is, it's a really cool mechanism. You can't see it, but there's actually 2 rows of fishing line on this harp trap, and they're staggered. So when the bats are exiting for their foraging that night, they know that there's a fishing line right here, and they go to avoid it and run into the other one. And then they gently tumble down into that green tarp, which is our catch basin. We lower that and we take the bats out and we take them over for processing where we're taking their sex, their age. We take wing measurements. We assess wing damage, whether it's from environmental factors or from white nose syndrome. We are able to tell if maybe the bat has had white nose in the past. We also look at any hair loss they might have. We look for parasites. We put a small little band on their forearm so we know if we catch them again in later years, and then we release them to finish their foraging for the night. So here's an example of kind of what it looks like processing a bat. Here on the left, you can see us looking at its wing, seeing if there's any damage. This is a beautiful looking bat wing. There's no holes. There's no scarring from white nose. This is a really healthy looking bat. And on the right is an excellent example of how we're able to tell if the bat is a juvenile or an adult. So once a bat hits its adult age, we're not really able to tell what exact age it is in terms of years. But we can tell the difference between a juvenile, so a bat that was born this year, or an adult. So here is a picture of a juvenile bat. You can see that, let me get this laser pointer here. You can see right here how there seems to be a separation in its finger joints. There's a little separation there and there's cartilage in the middle, and that indicates to us that's a juvenile bat. When they're fully an adult, this separation becomes fully fused and forms kind of a knot. So it's typically very clear whether the bat was born just that year or if it's an adult. And here is us releasing a bat after processing. So the other type of survey that we do is for rare species. This is conducted in typically forested areas near water, and it's in an effort to catch bats as they're foraging. So after a lot of scouting and looking at acoustic data, and we decide where we want to place these nets, we typically place 2 to 3 mist nets in a predetermined area within a relatively close range of each other. And once nightfall hits, we check them every 10 minutes for bats. Any bat that we catch is carefully extracted from the net and processed the same way as we do at the colonies. If we do catch a rare species, we might decide to fit it with a radio transmitter. This would allow us to track them for a short period of time, but it would give us knowledge of maybe where their summer roost sites might be and would add to our knowledge of habitat use and movement patterns that would inform future conservation decisions. So here, this picture on the left is actually a mist net that we have set up over a small creek. You can't really see the net. That's kind of the goal, but you can see the two poles on either side. Those poles are about 24 feet tall. You can see a person there kind of for reference. And yeah, the bats will just run into it while they're foraging, and the net creates kind of a soft pocket for them to fall into as they wait for us to get them out. And then here on the right is a transmitter fixed to a bat. Sometimes we will catch species we don't intend on catching, like this flying squirrel that we caught last year. While he's very cute, he's not very helpful when you're trying to catch bats, and he did scrunch up a decent amount of the net and kind of inhibited our efforts for a little bit. So that is in fact not a bat. The other type of survey that we do is one of our largest efforts, and it's our acoustic surveys. Some of them are passive and some of them are active. So we are part of something called the North American Bat Monitoring Program, which is called NABAT. And at its heart, this is just a large multi-agency program that provides standardized protocols for gathering data. And it also acts as a centralized hub for partners around the country like us to deposit our data. So according to NABAT guidelines, we deploy a variety of short-term detectors around the state from about mid-May to early July. These are deployed in the short term. Last year, we deployed 52 detectors over that period of time. They're out there for about 4 nights, maybe a couple of more nights, depending on the weather. And during this time, biologists and volunteers are also conducting what are considered driving transects, where people drive, they put a microphone detector to the top of their car, and they drive along these predetermined routes in areas where those stationary detectors are deployed. We also have long-term surveys going on around the state, one of which, as Patrick mentioned, is at the DuPont Nature Center. So here's a little map of where our long-term detectors are. We have 7 in the state. We have some at Fort Delaware, Bombay Hook, DuPont Nature Center, Delaware Seashore State Park Life Saving Station, and one up at the Brandywine Zoo. These detectors stay out every month of every year, and this is in an effort to document migration timing and species occurrence. The DuPont Nature Center is one of those locations, and here is a picture of what that looks like. And just some of the data that we collect, this chart shows the monthly amount of bat passes from January through September last year. You can see that gradual rise in passes starting in April and peaking in August as juveniles are beginning to be able to fly. And then here's the species breakdown of what bats that we were seeing last year at the DuPont Nature Center. So you can see that big spike in August can be attributed to the eastern red bats, and they continue to dominate in September as well. We also see a decent amount of big brown bats consistently, silver-haired bats in the spring, and a small showing of hoary and tricolored bats in the late summer and the early fall. And when I talk about processing the data and assigning species ID to these acoustic calls, I want to give you an idea of kind of how we do that. So these acoustic detectors we have set up to be triggered when they detect high frequency ultrasonic sounds, and they record those for us. And then we run the data through a program that determines the number of bat passes at each site and also will automatically identify what species made each call. However, auto ID can only go so far, and so we don't want to rely on it completely. So for rare species, we will look at each call to confirm if the species ID was correct. And as you can see here, calls are distinguished by frequency, shape, and pattern across the call sequence. So here's an idea of maybe what a northern long-eared bat calls look like. You can see they're very tall and thin, and they have a unique sequencing to them compared to, let's say, the tricolored bat calls that we have here, which are very short and fat and are pretty consistent in what they look like. So this data will tell us the presence of species, but not how many individuals there are. But it does help inform us where we want to consider for future forest catches. And once we have those results, we upload them to the NABAT monitoring program portal, and it helps inform coordinated efforts across the states for the entire species range. We also conduct hibernacula surveys. So in the winter, we will go to some of these known hibernacula sites to see what bats are hibernating there and how many. So as I mentioned, Fort Delaware and Fort DuPont State Park are some of these known hibernacula sites. But we have a few others as well that we will go and check to see if any bats are hanging out there over the winter. So what that looks like is a team of us will go to, for example, Fort Delaware. We're armed with flashlights and these beautiful white protective suits and gloves and booties. And we take these really bright flashlights and methodically scan the fort. We're searching between bricks and in cracks and corners because, as you can see, they can squeeze into really teeny tiny areas. And we count every bat that we find so we can compare year to year how many bats are using the fort. And as I mentioned earlier, we will also swab the walls, the substrate, and sometimes even the bats themselves. So we can get samples to test for PD, and we'll also kind of give a cursory look to the bats to see if we can see any white nose syndrome. But we do our best to not disturb them because, as I mentioned, hibernation disturbance is not great for these little guys. So we don't really get all up in their business. We just try and take samples as we go. So this graph over here shows the amount of bats that we've seen in Fort Delaware over time. There has been a decrease, but there's still a good amount of bats that are using the fort to hibernate. Fort Delaware is actually the only site that has had hibernating bats over the last few years, and all of them have been big brown bats for almost 10 years now. But we continue to monitor these other previously used hibernacula sites to make sure that we're not missing anything. So ways that you can help out, one of the big ways is you might remember me mentioning our volunteer bat spotters that do these emergence counts for us. So one way you can help out, if you know of a colony, please let us know. We're always on the lookout for new sites to do emergence counts at. But if not, no worries, you can still do emergence counts because we still have sites in all 3 counties that do need counting. And as a bat spotter, you can also, if you choose to, participate in acoustic driving transects. And then you might have the chance to come to some of our catches as well, which is probably the biggest draw to be able to see some of these little guys in person. So here's a video just of bats emerging from bat houses. They're super cute and super fast. But if you don't have the time to be a bat spotter or you want other ways to help, there are still plenty of things you can do. You can donate to rehabbers. The rehabbers in the state of Delaware do this because they care about bats and wildlife. They do not get paid, and most of them have a pretty good wish list of supplies that they need to help take care of sick and injured or misplaced bats. Other things you can do is plant a bat garden. So it's similar to a pollinator garden, except instead of planting to attract bees and butterflies and other pollinators, you're attracting the type of insects that bats might want to eat, like moths and beetles. Don't worry, I'm not asking you to attract mosquitoes to your yard. There's plenty of those. We don't need to help them out with that. There's plenty of resources online if you look up bat garden on what plants and other native flowers and plants that you might be able to put out. You can also put up a bat house. Unfortunately, this does not attract bats to your home, nor does it guarantee that bats are going to use it, but it certainly doesn't hurt to provide an alternative roost site. And if bats do start using it, please let me know. And then finally, if none of those options appeal to you, just spread the word, correct misconceptions and myths about bats when you hear them, educate your friends and family, and let them know how cool these little guys are and how helpful for humans they actually are. So that kind of winds up everything that I have to say about bats. I did want to put our email up here if you have more questions or concerns about bats. Our email is batspotters@delaware.gov. Or you can visit our website where you can sign up to be a volunteer bat spotter and find other resources on bats.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rachel. That was really cool. That was awesome. I love the videos of the bats flying around, and it's some awesome information. So right now we'll open up the floor. If there's any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat. This is a good time to ask any type of, bat knowledge you're hoping to find. This would be a perfect time for it. So we'll see if anyone types anything in. In the meantime, okay, so I have one. Could bats eat spotted lanternflies, or do you know if they do?
Oh, that is a really good question. I actually don't know if they do, but I would imagine they would because it fits right into the type of insects they like. Obviously, depending on the bat species, some bats go for more soft-bodied insects over harder bodies like beetles and stuff, but I wouldn't imagine they would be too picky over them.
It's a good question. Yes. I hope they do. I really do.
I hope they do too. I would imagine so. I would imagine so.
Um, Another question that I have is you talked about white nose syndrome, and it seems like, at least in some areas, is on the downturn. Is there anything that the public can do if they know they're near areas with bats that can help, make sure that they're not potentially tracking in any pathogens, any things like that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, some things, this doesn't really apply to Delaware necessarily, but where there are caves and where caving or rocky outcropping exploration is popular, just being aware of where you are and decontaminating any equipment if you've entered into caves, and that goes for anywhere you go around the country. Just decontamination is really important. But as far as here in Delaware, if you have a known bat roost and you think you've seen signs of white nose syndrome, definitely let us know. But with spreading pathogens, it's really hard not to. But for example, going to Fort Delaware and doing tours up there, they are really great. There's bat mats out there where you can decontaminate your shoes as you walk in. They also give you little booties to wear when you're doing tours up there, and then you also decontaminate your shoes walking back out. So in terms of that, that's kind of the best thing that we can do here is just being aware of where bats are and decontaminating when appropriate. But other than that, there's not really anything that the public can do.
That's great information.
Mhm.
Nicole wrote that she put up 4 bat boxes on their property. No
Yeah.
bats yet, but are hoping to let people know when they have. So,
That's
um,
fantastic.
and Jody has asked, what is the primary predator for bats?
That's a really good question. So depending on the species, there are, where they're existing, where they're living, it can change. Unfortunately, feral cats are a pretty big issue for bats. So I would put them up there. Uh, Screech owls, like not large owls, but smaller predatory birds. But there's really not any big main predators for bats. It's really just the disturbances that they get during their hibernation or people being really mad about their existence.
Nice. Rebecca has asked if this information would also apply to the North Carolina area or potentially maybe just other regional states.
Yeah, so that's my mom. So hi mom, love you. Um but yeah, this information is pretty general. Like the bats here in the country are insectivorous, so you can apply a lot of those general characteristics to the bats around the country. North Carolina has a few more species of bats than we do. But there is a lot of crossover. Like I said, big browns are pretty much everywhere. I know North Carolina has silver-hairs and evening bats as well. But the whole cave bat versus tree bat distinguish that still applies. So yeah, it's can be applied to kind of bats all over the country, really.
Something I do always like to ask our presenters here as well is you might have mentioned a little bit before, but what got you into this line of work and what do you really enjoy about being able to do this type of work?
Yeah, so I actually got into bats a little bit of a roundabout way. I actually started working with the Delaware or Delmarva Fox Squirrel Project when I first moved up here to Delaware a few years ago. And bats and fox squirrels actually fall under the same biologist umbrella. So I got to inadvertently work with the Bat Project a little bit and then kind of shimmied on over because I really enjoyed working with the bats. And I do fortunately still get to work with the squirrels too, so I still get the best of both worlds. But I've always had more of a lean towards some of the animals that are more misunderstood. Growing up, sharks were my favorite animals. I thought wild boars were cute. So I've always kind of enjoyed kind of the more not as cute animals, even though I think bats are adorable. And like a lot of bat enthusiast, I do like spooky things too. So I feel like bats was kind of a perfect intersection of all of the things I enjoy. And the more I've gotten to work with them and the more I've learned about them, I've come to really appreciate them more than I ever could have imagined. And I think they're absolutely adorable, which also helps.
Awesome. I think that does it for questions. Michelle Garrett did mention that brown bats and east or big browns and eastern reds do eat spotted lanternflies, so that's good to
That
hear.
makes sense.
That's awesome. So thank you for that, Michelle. Um, oh yes, another question. Do you know how far the banded bats travel?
That is such a good question. So, bats in general, especially the tree bats, as I mentioned, they're kind of hard to study and get their full range of motion. So the short answer is not really, but it also depends on the species. So, as I mentioned, like the evening bats, they had been tracked, hundreds of miles away from where they were first banded. But really, those little transmitters that we put on bats to kind of track them really only get done during the summer because that's when they're foraging the most. That's when their maternity season is. So that's when we have the best opportunity to even put a tracker on them. Once the fall hits and the migrators start migrating, we're kind of out of luck there because those trackers only really they're so tiny. They only really last for about 30 days. And that's if the bat doesn't decide to groom it off before the tracker dies. So we really struggle to get that long-term data. So like I said, short answer, no. Longer answer, depends on the species, but also kind of no.
Thank you so much for taking your time to educate us about the bats here in Delaware, and just share some information about the amazing work that y'all do across our state. Again, we've posted the links for the Bat Spotter program if you're looking for more information or even want to volunteer to be part of the program. A few other people have asked about other programs, lists, things like that. Rachel was just the very first person in our winter lecture series, so she kicked things off to a fly-in sharp-toothed sharp start, I would say here. It's a little kind of bad pun that didn't really work. We will be doing our second talk of the winter lecture series, where another one of our fish and wildlife coworkers, Jordan Brown and her team, will be here to discuss how they use radio technology to gather information on the movements of American kestrels, which are the small, amazing falcon, and how a newly outfitted tower right here at the DuPont Nature Center is helping contribute to the research. So some more information from some other really cool coworkers we work with in the jobs they do around our states.